It was a chilly evening in downtown Los Angeles. The streets bustled with life. Businessmen in suits hurried to meetings, teenagers laughed over their phones, and families gathered in restaurants. Among them, a lone figure walked slowly, unnoticed by the crowd. His hoodie was faded and oversized, his jeans tattered, and his beard slightly unkempt. He carried a worn-out backpack, its straps barely holding together. The man wasn't just any homeless person. He was Keanu Reeves, disguised and observing the world from a different perspective. As he approached a small McDonald's, the bright yellow glow of the iconic arches reflected in the puddles on the pavement. He took a deep breath before stepping inside. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around him instantly, and the scent of fresh fries and sizzling burgers filled his nostrils. Inside, customers sat at their tables, munching on food, chatting, or scrolling through their phones. A young couple in the corner whispered to each other while sharing a milkshake. A group of teens laughed loudly, occasionally glancing at a TikTok on one of their screens. A tired-looking construction worker sipped on a coffee, lost in thought. At first, no one paid attention to the man in ragged clothes. But as he moved toward the counter, whispers started. A woman wrinkled her nose and scooted her purse closer. A teenager nudged his friend and snickered. A businessman frowned in disapproval. Keanu stood patiently in line, waiting his turn. When he reached the front, the cashier, a young woman named Lisa, hesitated. Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "A small coffee, please," Keanu said, placing a handful of crumpled bills and coins on the counter. Lisa glanced at her manager, Steve, a stocky, middle-aged man with a permanent scowl. Before Lisa could respond, Steve strode over. "We don't serve beggars," he said coldly. Keanu met his eyes, calm and unwavering. "I'm not begging. I'm paying for a coffee." Steve scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. Next, you'll be asking for handouts. Get out." Lisa's fingers trembled. "But, now," Steve barked. Keanu sighed, nodded politely, and turned to leave. He had seen what he came to see. And soon, everyone in that McDonald's would learn a lesson they would never forget. Keanu stepped away from the counter, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets. The weight of judgment in the room was heavy, pressing against him like an invisible force. He could feel the stares, the quiet murmurs, the dismissive glances. Lisa, the cashier, hesitated before casting an apologetic look toward Keanu. She clearly wanted to help but was too afraid of her boss. Steve, the manager, folded his arms smugly, watching as Keanu slowly walked away. As he moved toward the seating area, a group of teenagers at a booth started snickering. "Guess McDonald's has a new mascot," one of them muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe he's looking for leftover fries in the trash," another sneered. Keanu, unfazed, found an empty table in the corner and sat down. He placed his old backpack beside him, pulled out a small notebook, and began to write. His fingers moved steadily across the paper, jotting down notes as he observed everything, the way people treated him, the fear in Lisa's eyes, the arrogance in Steve's stance. A few tables away, an elderly man with a kind face watched him curiously. Unlike the others, he didn't sneer or look away. Instead, he seemed thoughtful, as if recognizing something in Keanu. Meanwhile, Steve strutted around the restaurant, making sure everyone saw his authority. He made a point to walk past Keanu's table and scoff loudly. "You need to leave, buddy. We don't run a shelter here." Keanu looked up, meeting his eyes. He spoke softly, but firmly. "I'm not bothering anyone." Steve's lips curled into a smirk. "Yeah, well, people don't want to eat next to someone who looks like they crawled out of a dumpster." The room fell into silence. A few customers glanced at each other awkwardly. Lisa bit her lip and stared down at the register, clearly uncomfortable. The elderly man who had been watching finally spoke. "Maybe you should show a little kindness," he said to Steve. "You never know who you're talking to." Steve scoffed. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. A nobody." Keanu didn't react. He simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. What Steve didn't realize was that his words would soon come back to haunt him in the most unexpected way. Steve, the arrogant manager, let out a short laugh after his remark. He enjoyed the feeling of control, of putting people in their place. To him, Keanu was just another homeless man wasting space in his restaurant. "You've had your fun," Steve said, folding his arms. "Now get out before I call security." Keanu remained still, his piercing eyes studying Steve. He could see what kind of man he was, someone who thrived on belittling others, mistaking cruelty for power. Keanu had encountered many like him before. The elderly man who had spoken earlier sighed, shaking his head. "You really have no idea, do you?" he muttered. Steve ignored him, turning back to Keanu. "Are you deaf, too?" I said. Before he could finish, the restaurant door suddenly opened, and a well-dressed man in a tailored suit walked in. His sharp eyes scanned the room before locking onto Keanu. "Sir, I've been looking everywhere for you," the man said, rushing forward. The entire restaurant went quiet. The customers, the cashiers, even the teenagers at the booth stopped mid-bite. Lisa's eyes widened in shock. Steve frowned. "Sir," he repeated, confused. The man in the suit, Keanu's assistant, Daniel, gave him a disapproving look before turning to Keanu. "The press conference is in an hour. We need to go." Steve's smug expression wavered. "Press conference?" Daniel sighed and turned to him. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked. Steve looked back at Keanu, his mind racing. The hoodie, the scruffy disguise, it was all meant to deceive. And it had worked. The teenagers at the booth whispered among themselves. "No way. That's Keanu Reeves." Steve's face went pale. He suddenly felt sick, as if all the power he had enjoyed a moment ago had been yanked from beneath him. Keanu stood up, grabbing his old backpack. He turned to Lisa and gave her a small nod of thanks before finally looking at Steve. "You judged me without knowing me," Keanu said calmly. "That's a mistake people make far too often." Steve swallowed hard, but before he could stammer out a response, Keanu turned and walked toward the exit with Daniel. As the doors swung closed behind him, the restaurant remained frozen in stunned silence. The silence in the McDonald's was thick, suffocating. Steve, the once confident manager, stood frozen behind the counter. His face had drained of color as reality settled in. He had just humiliated Keanu Reeves, a man loved by millions, a Hollywood legend, and more importantly, a person who had done nothing but sit quietly and observe. Lisa, the young cashier, watched Steve's expression shift from confusion to panic. "You really messed up," she muttered under her breath. The teenagers in the booth, who had been making fun of Keanu earlier, sat still, wide-eyed. "Dude, we just mocked John Wick," one of them whispered. Steve finally found his voice. He forced out a nervous chuckle, wiping his sweaty palms on his uniform. I didn't know." He looked. He cut himself off, realizing there was no excuse for his behavior. The elderly man who had stood up for Keanu shook his head. "That's the problem, son. You didn't bother to know. You just assumed." A few customers murmured in agreement. The weight of their judgment pressed down on Steve harder than he had expected. Lisa, still fuming, turned back to Steve. "If you had even an ounce of kindness, you wouldn't have treated anyone like that. Doesn't matter if he was a movie star or not." Steve shifted uncomfortably. He had prided himself on running a tight ship, believing that strictness and arrogance kept order in his store. But now, standing here in front of customers who had just witnessed his downfall, he saw himself in a different light, a small man who had let his ego control him. The glass doors swung open again. A woman in a business suit entered, scanning the room. Spotting Lisa, she smiled. "Lisa Bennett." Lisa blinked in surprise. Yes, I'm Jennifer Clark, Keanu Reeves' assistant," the woman introduced herself. "Mr. Reeves was impressed with your kindness today. He asked me to offer you a position at one of the charities he supports. If you're interested, of course." Lisa's jaw dropped. Are you serious?" Jennifer nodded, smiling. Steve's heart sank even further. Not only had he lost all respect in the room, but the very employee he had dismissed as insignificant had just been noticed by one of the biggest stars in the world. For the first time in years, Steve felt something he hadn't before: regret. The air in the McDonald's remained heavy with tension as Lisa stood frozen in shock. Keanu Reeves' assistant, Jennifer Clark, had just offered her a job opportunity, an opportunity she never could have imagined. Lisa turned to Keanu, who still sat at his table, looking at her with the same gentle kindness he had shown from the start. I don't know what to say, Lisa stammered. Keanu finally stood, stretching slightly before giving her a warm smile. Say yes, if you want it. You have a good heart, Lisa. People like you make the world a better place. Lisa felt tears sting her eyes. She had always believed that being kind was just the right thing to do, never expecting anything in return. But now, kindness had changed her life. The entire restaurant was still watching, some recording the moment on their phones. Steve, the manager, swallowed hard, his face still pale. He had spent years believing that power came from authority, from control. But today, he had been proven wrong in the most humiliating way. His arrogance had not only made him look small, but it had cost him the respect of his staff and customers. Keanu turned toward Steve, his expression unreadable. Steve, right, Steve nodded, barely able to meet his eyes. Keanu sighed. I don't hold grudges, but I do believe in second chances. He let the words hang in the air before continuing. I hope you take this moment to reflect. Treat people with respect, no matter who they are. You never know their story. Steve opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't used to apologizing, but he knew he needed to. Finally, he exhaled. I'm sorry. Keanu nodded, accepting it without further humiliation. Good. Now, make it count. With that, he turned back to Lisa. Jennifer will give you all the details. No pressure. Just know that you deserve better, and I think you're meant for great things. Lisa smiled, her heart full. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. As Keanu walked toward the door, he glanced back at Steve once more. Oh, and Steve, maybe try smiling at your customers once in a while. It's free. A soft chuckle spread through the restaurant as Keanu left, leaving behind not just an unforgettable moment, but a powerful lesson in kindness, humility, and second chances.